Nathan Cole's house had always been quiet. That was the one thing he could count on after everything else fell apart. So when he opened the front door that Tuesday night and found Victoria Hale standing on his porch, his company's CEO rain soaking through her coat, a suitcase at her feet, his mind went completely blank. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She stepped inside, set the suitcase down on his living room floor, and said 4 words that made the walls feel like they were closing in. "I'm staying here with you." Nathan Cole had a system. Not a life, exactly a system. He woke at 6, made coffee with the same ratio of grounds he'd calculated 3 years ago, drove the same route to the Black Ridge Group offices in downtown Seattle, and was back home by 7 in the evening. The house was small, just under 1,200 square feet, tucked between 2 larger properties, on a street that nobody passed through, unless they lived there. He hadn't chosen it for its charm. He'd chosen it because it was quiet. And quiet was the one thing Nathan had learned to protect after his marriage ended. The divorce hadn't been dramatic. That was almost the worst part, the way it happened calmly, efficiently, like a project reaching its natural conclusion. His ex-wife Claire had said he was already somewhere else, even when he was standing right in front of her. She wasn't wrong. Nathan had always been more comfortable with load-bearing calculations and stress fracture reports than with the kind of conversations that required him to sit still and feel something. He kept the house. She kept everything that had made it feel like a home. He told himself that was a fair trade. At Black Ridge Group, Nathan was known for 2 things: his precision and his silence. He worked in structural engineering, responsible for making sure the buildings the company designed would actually stand. His reports were detailed to the point where some colleagues found them excessive, but in 7 years, not a single project he'd signed off on had come back with a structural complaint. His director trusted his numbers. The board barely knew his name, and Victoria Hale, the CEO, who had taken over Black Ridge 4 years ago and doubled its revenue inside of 18 months, had never once spoken to him directly. He existed somewhere below her line of sight, which was exactly where he preferred to be. He had seen her in all-hands meetings, standing at the front of the conference room, in the kind of composed stillness that made everyone else straighten their posture without realizing it. Victoria Hale was 40 years old, ran the company with a precision that made Nathan's own habits look casual, and was known in Seattle's business circles for one quality above all others. She did not make mistakes. Not publicly. Not in ways that could be measured. Nathan respected that the way you respect a structure that's been engineered correctly from a distance without needing to be inside it. That was the version of Victoria Hale he knew. The one standing in his doorway that Tuesday night was something different entirely. Her coat was soaked through her hair, coming loose at the edges from the rain. She had a single roller suitcase and an expression Nathan couldn't immediately categorize. Not fear, but something beneath composure. Something that had been held in place so long it was starting to fracture. He moved back instinctively when she stepped inside. She rolled the suitcase into the center of his living room, like she'd already mapped the space in her head. He asked the only question that made sense. "What happened?" Victoria didn't sit down immediately. She stood in his living room, taking in the space with the quiet assessment she probably gave to acquisitions reports, and then she sat on the edge of his couch and told him what she knew. Her voice was level, the kind of controlled that takes practice, not calm. 3 days ago, she had found a discrepancy in a financial report that shouldn't have existed. A transfer routed through a subsidiary account that didn't match any approved expenditure. When she'd pulled the thread, she found more, not a single mistake, but a pattern, deliberate and layered, built over at least 14 months. Someone inside the board had been moving money, and the architecture of the fraud was designed with one specific feature. It led back to her. Nathan sat in the chair across from her and listened without interrupting. She had gone to the company's legal counsel first, she said, and that was when she understood how far it had gone. The attorney she'd trusted for 3 years had gone quiet in a way that told her everything. By the time she got back to her penthouse that evening, she was certain her communications were being monitored. Her phone, her email, possibly her personal laptop. She had turned them all off, left them in her apartment, and come here with a prepaid phone bought with cash from a pharmacy 2 blocks away. She had chosen Nathan Cole specifically because he was the one person in that company who had never asked her for anything. Not a promotion, not a favor, not even a conversation in the hallway. In her experience, the people who never asked for anything were the only ones who couldn't be bought. Nathan absorbed that. He wasn't sure whether it was a compliment or a statement of fact. With Victoria Hale, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. She said she needed a place where no one would look for her while she figured out her next move, and someone with technical knowledge she could trust. Nathan's structural reports had crossed her desk twice in the past year, both times on projects where the board had pushed for cost reductions in materials, and both times Nathan had pushed back with documentation airtight enough to override them. She had noticed. She hadn't said anything at the time. But she had noticed. Nathan looked at his living room, 1,200 square feet. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that fit 2 people only if neither of them moved quickly. He thought about his system, his 6 a.m. coffee, his carefully maintained silence. He said, "The couch pulls out." Victoria looked at the couch with an expression that lasted about 1 second before she replaced it with something neutral. "That's fine," she said. He showed her where the extra blankets were pointed out the empty shelf in the bathroom cabinet and told her he had work in the morning and she was welcome to whatever was in the kitchen. She thanked him in the same tone she probably used to thank people who held elevators for her precise, impersonal already moving on to the next thought. Nathan lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the windows. Through the thin wall, he could hear the faint sound of someone else moving in his living room, the creak of the pull-out frame, the soft arrangement of blankets. He couldn't remember the last time there had been another person in this house at night. The sound made the space feel both smaller and in some way he didn't examine too closely less empty. He told himself she'd be gone in a few days. In the morning, he found her already awake at his kitchen table, the prepaid phone beside a yellow legal pad, covered in handwriting so small and dense it looked like code. She had made coffee a full pot with a second mug sitting next to his spot at the table, as though she had calculated exactly where he would stand. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have registered. But it did. He sat down, and she turned the legal pad toward him. At the top of the first page, she had written 2 names, Gerald Marsh and Douglas Rain, both senior board members. Below their names were dates, amounts, and a chain of subsidiary accounts reconstructed from memory. Nathan looked at the layout and recognized the structure immediately hierarchical evidence-based, built from the bottom up. Whatever else Victoria Hale was, she thought in systems too. She said she needed someone to verify the technical side, specifically whether the financial irregularities lined up with changes made to approved project specifications. The kind of changes that would show up in engineering documents, not board minutes. The kind only someone in Nathan's department would know how to find. Nathan looked at the legal pad. He looked at his coffee. Then he told her he would start with the Alcott Tower files, the larger of the 2 projects the board had tried to cut corners on a commercial high-rise, currently in the final phase before groundbreaking 3 blocks from Seattle's waterfront. If someone had altered the material specifications on that project, the documentation would still exist somewhere in the approval chain. Victoria circled Alcott Tower on the legal pad and said, "Don't access anything from the office network. Personal credentials only from here." Nathan said he understood. He finished his coffee, picked up his bag, and walked out the front door into a Seattle morning that looked exactly the same as it always did. But somewhere between the kitchen table and the front porch, something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way he could fully name yet. Just the quiet, certain knowledge that the system he had built his life around had already started running on different rules. The first 3 days were an exercise in tolerance. Nathan's house had never been designed for two people with incompatible operating rhythms. He worked in silence and needed the kind of deep, uninterrupted quiet where he could sit with a set of blueprints for 4 hours without surfacing. Victoria worked in motion, pacing the living room, while she thought talking through her logic out loud, whether or not anyone was listening, writing on his yellow legal pads and handwriting so compressed it was almost aggressive. By the second morning, he'd found 3 of his pens on her side of the kitchen table. By the third evening, she had reorganized his bookshelf by subject matter, without asking, because she said alphabetical organization was inefficient. Nathan moved the books back. Victoria watched him do it without commenting. That was how most of their disagreements went stated, once absorbed, filed away, and never fully resolved. The tension between them wasn't just about space. Every evening when Nathan came home, they sat at the kitchen table and went over what he'd found, alongside what Victoria had pieced together from memory, and from the handful of documents she'd managed to export to a personal drive before going dark. The strategy conversations were where things got sharp. Victoria approached the problem from the top-down board structure, shareholder relationships, legal angles. Nathan approached it from the bottom-up document trail, specifications, approval timestamps. Neither approach was wrong, but they kept arriving at different conclusions about what move to make next, and neither of them was naturally inclined to defer. One night, after an argument that started over which files to prioritize and ended somewhere near a fundamental disagreement about risk tolerance, Victoria stood at the kitchen window with her arms crossed and said, "You don't trust instinct at all, do you?" Nathan said, "Instinct doesn't hold up in a courtroom." Victoria looked at him with something that wasn't quite irritation. "Neither does caution," she said, "when you're out of time." He didn't have a clean answer for that. He went back to his laptop. She went back to her legal pad. The kitchen went quiet except for the rain, which seemed to fall every other night in Seattle that week, as though the weather had decided to mirror the general situation. On the 4th day, Nathan found what they had both been looking for. After that, the arguments stopped mattering. He had been working through the Alcott Tower approval chain for 6 days, pulling files through his personal credentials each evening, cross-referencing original specifications against the amended versions that had passed through the board's procurement committee. The project was a 32-story commercial high-rise, fully permitted and scheduled to break ground in 11 weeks. On paper, it was Blackridge Group's most significant contract in 5 years. In the board's investor presentations, it was the project that would define the company's next decade. What Nathan found in the specification files told a different story. The original structural design had called for a specific grade of reinforced steel in the building's core columns, a standard Nathan himself had signed off on 18 months ago during the preliminary engineering review. Somewhere between that review and the final procurement approval, the specification had been changed. Not removed, changed. The replacement material met minimum code requirements on paper, but minimum code and engineering soundness were not the same thing. Nathan had spent enough years in this field to know exactly what happened to buildings in the Pacific Northwest when the structural core was under-engineered. Seattle sat on a fault line. The soil conditions near the waterfront were not forgiving. The original specification had accounted for all of that. The amended one had not. He sat with the documents open on his laptop for a long time before he said anything. Victoria came to the table and read through what he was pointing to twice without speaking. The color in her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. She asked him to explain in plain terms what it meant for the building. He told her, if Alcott Tower was built to the amended specifications and the city experienced a significant seismic event, the structural failure risk in the lower floors was not theoretical. It was calculable. He had already calculated it. Victoria sat down slowly. She said, "They were always planning to build it this way." Nathan said yes. She said, "And when something happens, every approval document has my signature on the final project authorization." Nathan said yes again, because it was true. Victoria had signed the cover document 14 months ago before any of the material substitutions had been made. But to anyone looking at it afterward, her signature would sit on a project built with structurally compromised materials. The substitutions had been buried 5 layers deep in procurement subcommittee records, the kind a CEO would never personally review, the kind that required Nathan's specific technical knowledge to even locate. It wasn't just a financial conspiracy, it was a structural one. They had used the building itself as the weapon. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, but this time she wasn't frustrated. She was thinking with her whole body, shoulders back, jaw set, that stillness that looked like composure, but was actually something more like a controlled burn. After a while, she said, "We need everything. Every amended document, every procurement approval, every timestamp that shows when the changes were made, and who authorized them." Nathan told her he had already started the archive, not just screenshots, but full document exports, with metadata intact version histories, the complete audit trail. It was the same methodology he used for his engineering reports, redundant, traceable, impossible to dismiss as selective. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was new, not warm. Victoria Hale didn't traffic in warmth as a default setting, but something had shifted in how she was reading him. A recalibration, like she was seeing him at a different resolution. She said, "How long until you have enough?" He told her 3 more days, maybe 4. She said, "We don't have 4. She was right. The pressure came the next morning. Nathan arrived at the office to find a meeting request on his calendar, a one-on-one with Gerald Marsh, scheduled for 10 a.m. in the 31st floor conference room. Sent the previous evening at 7:43, after standard business hours, not casual. Gerald Marsh had been on Blackridge's board for 9 years. He was the kind of man who wore his seniority in every posture, slow to move, deliberate in speech, with the particular confidence of someone who had outlasted several changes in leadership and expected to outlast several more. He was already in the conference room when Nathan arrived, sitting at the head of the table with a coffee he hadn't touched and a folder positioned in the center of the table like a prop. What followed was 22 minutes of a conversation that was technically friendly and functionally a threat. Marsh talked about the company's upcoming transition period, about the board's confidence in its senior technical staff, about the kind of opportunities that emerged for people who demonstrated institutional loyalty during difficult times. He mentioned in passing that the director of engineering position was going to be restructured, expanded, and that a small number of people in the organization had come up in those discussions. He didn't say Nathan's name directly. He didn't need to. Then he said he'd heard Nathan had been accessing archived project files from a remote connection over the past week. Routine audit flag, nothing concerning. Just wanted to make sure Nathan knew the board was available if he had questions. Nathan said he'd been doing a personal technical review. Standard practice before a project went to groundbreaking. Marsh looked at him for a moment, with the eyes of a man who knew when someone was choosing their words carefully. Then he smiled, closed the folder without opening it, and said he was glad they'd had the chance to talk. Nathan walked back to his desk and did not move for approximately 4 minutes. Then he opened his laptop and kept working. That evening, he told Victoria everything. When he finished, she said the timeline had just moved up. If Marsh knew he'd been accessing the archive, the documents were at risk. She asked how much of the evidence package was complete. Nathan said roughly 70%. She said they needed 100% by tomorrow night. He worked until 2 in the morning. Victoria sat across the table and went through every document he exported, building a parallel index on her legal pads, cross-referencing the financial transfers she had reconstructed from memory against the procurement amendments he was pulling from the files. It was the first night they had worked in the same rhythm, both of them moving through the problem from their different angles and arriving for once at the same place at the same time. At some point after midnight, Nathan made coffee. He set a mug on her side of the table without saying anything. She picked it up without looking away from the document she was reading. It was a small thing, but it was the first time since she'd arrived that the house felt the right size. The call came 2 days later on a Thursday morning. Victoria had a source, a former colleague she had trusted enough to contact through the prepaid phone. The source told her that Gerald Marsh and Douglas Rain had called an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. The stated agenda was a governance review. The actual agenda was a vote removal of the CEO for cause on the grounds of financial mismanagement. The documentation they planned to present had been prepared by an outside firm, clean professional, and built entirely from the fraudulent records they had spent 14 months constructing. Victoria set the phone down on the table and told Nathan what she'd heard. He asked if the source was reliable. She said yes without hesitation. He asked if there was any chance the vote wouldn't pass. She said that with the financial documentation the board was planning to present, and with her communications shut down and her access to internal systems effectively cut off, she had no way to counter the narrative in time. The shareholders who mattered would follow the board's recommendation. She said, "I think it's over." Nathan looked at the table. The evidence archive was complete, finished at 11:47 the previous night, backed up in 2 additional secure locations beyond the encrypted drive. 78 documents, full audit trails, version histories with timestamps showing every amendment, every authorization, every procurement decision made in the shadows of a project whose failure was supposed to destroy her. He had everything. The question was what to do with it in a room full of people who had already decided the outcome. Victoria's expression had something in it Nathan hadn't seen before. Not defeat exactly, but the edge of it. The place where composure meets exhaustion. He said, "The meeting is Monday." She said yes. He said, "I'll be there." She looked at him. Then doing the calculation, he could see her running what he was proposing, what it would cost him, whether she believed he would actually follow through. He'd had this look directed at him before, from people who had confused his quietness with passivity and were now revising their assessment. He said, "I have 78 documents that say the board altered the structural specifications on a 32-story building near a fault line. I'm the only person in that company whose name means anything when it comes to those numbers. If I walk into that meeting and put that analysis on the table, they can't ignore it." Victoria said, "They'll try." Nathan said, "Let them." She spoke again after a moment, her voice level but weighted. She said, "If you do this, they'll come after your career. Marsh has the connections to make sure you never work in structural engineering in this state again." Nathan said he understood that. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, not with drama, not with a speech. He understood it, and he was going to do it anyway. The building was going to be dangerous. People were going to be in it. That was the part that had never really been a question. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once the way she nodded when a decision had been made, and there was nothing left to deliberate. She picked up the legal pad and started writing with the focused economy of someone preparing for the most important meeting of her professional life. Nathan opened his laptop and started formatting the final analysis document. The rain had stopped for once. Outside, the Seattle morning was clear and cold, and the house was quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not empty, but settled. Like something that had been under pressure for a long time had finally found its shape. Monday came in cold and clear, which felt like a bad joke. Nathan drove to the Black Ridge Group offices at 7:45, earlier than he'd arrived in years. He had the evidence archive on an encrypted drive in his jacket pocket and a printed copy of his technical analysis in a folder under his arm. He took the elevator to the 31st floor, walked past the conference room where the emergency board meeting was scheduled to begin at 9, and went to his desk. He opened his laptop. He did not access any company systems. He just sat there and waited the way he had learned to wait, when a structural calculation required more time than the deadline allowed, without impatience, without the illusion that urgency would make the math resolve faster. At 8:53, he picked up his folder and walked to the conference room. The room was already full. Gerald Marsh sat at the head of the table. Douglas Rain to his right, and 4 other board members arranged around them with the slightly formal posture of people who had been briefed in advance and knew exactly how the next hour was supposed to go. The company's acting general counsel was there, along with 2 outside consultants brought in by Marsh to add institutional weight. 3 faces Nathan recognized as major shareholders, members of Blackridge's Investor Advisory Committee, told him that Marsh had been thorough. He had stacked the room. Nobody had expected Nathan Cole to walk through that door. Marsh looked at him the way a man looks at something that has appeared in the wrong place. Not alarm, but a recalibration. He said in a tone designed to sound procedural that this was a closed governance meeting and that Nathan's department hadn't been included in the agenda. Nathan said he understood that. Then he set his folder on the table. He said he had a structural engineering matter directly relevant to the board's current business, and that, as the senior structural engineer on the Alcott Tower project, he had a professional and legal obligation to present his findings before any governance decisions were finalized. He said it without raising his voice, precise, sequential, each sentence constructed, so that the next one was impossible to dismiss. The room went quiet in the way rooms get when the script has just been changed by someone who wasn't supposed to have a script. One of the shareholders, a man named Frank Holloway, who had been on Blackridge's investor committee for 7 years and carried the permanent expression of someone who had survived enough boardroom theater to be skeptical of all of it, said, "Let him present." Marsh looked at Holloway. Then he sat back. Nathan opened the folder. What followed was 31 minutes of the most controlled presentation Nathan had ever given. He walked the room through the original Alcott Tower structural specifications, the ones he had personally reviewed and approved 18 months ago. He walked them through the amendment chain, each substitution, each procurement authorization, each version of each document, with its metadata intact, showing exactly when the changes had been made, and exactly which accounts within the board's procurement subcommittee had authorized them. He had printed the full 78-document archive in a sequence that told the story, even if you only read the first page of each one. He had highlighted the timestamps. He had highlighted the authorization signatures. On the final page, a 1-page engineering summary explained what the material substitutions meant for a 32-story building constructed near a seismic zone on waterfront soil conditions. He did not use the word fraud. He did not have to. The documents used it for him. The room got very still about 12 minutes in when Nathan laid the procurement authorization documents side by side with the original and amended specifications and explained the delta in plain terms. It got stiller when Frank Holloway leaned forward and asked Nathan to repeat the seismic risk assessment finding. Nathan repeated it. Holloway wrote something down. Douglas Rain said halfway through that the documents were being misrepresented, that the procurement amendments had gone through proper approval channels, and that Nathan was drawing conclusions outside his purview. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. Nathan said he was drawing conclusions within his exact purview because structural engineering analysis of approved specifications was precisely his purview, and he had 7 years of signed reports at Blackridge Group to demonstrate that. He said it without looking at Rain after the first sentence. He was already moving to the next document. By the time Nathan reached the final page, Marsh had not spoken for 11 minutes. Rain had stopped trying. The acting general counsel had closed his own folder and was looking at the table. Frank Holloway had filled 2 pages of notes. When Nathan finished, he placed the printed archive in the center of the table and set the encrypted drive next to it. He said the full digital record, complete metadata, and version histories was on the drive, and that the same archive had been backed up in 2 additional secure locations. He formally requested that the Alcott Tower groundbreaking be suspended, pending an independent structural review, and stated that he was submitting his findings to the board's legal counsel as of that morning. Then he sat down. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Frank Holloway looked at Gerald Marsh and said, "I want an independent audit of everything in this folder. Today." His voice had the flat certainty of a man whose instinct for financial exposure had just been activated, and whose investment did not depend on loyalty to anyone in this room. The governance vote never happened. The meeting dissolved into something else entirely. A controlled emergency, the kind of institutional pivot that happens when the people with the most to lose realize the ground has shifted. Within 48 hours, Gerald Marsh and Douglas Rain had been suspended pending investigation. The acting general counsel filed a disclosure with the company's outside auditors by end of business that same day. The Alcott Tower groundbreaking was postponed indefinitely. 3 days after the meeting, the Seattle Business Journal ran a story about an internal investigation at Blackridge Group. The story didn't use anyone's name yet, but it was the beginning of something that names would eventually follow. Victoria returned to the company 11 days after the board meeting. The announcement went out on a Tuesday morning, a brief official statement confirming that the CEO had been cleared of any involvement in the financial irregularities under investigation and would resume operational leadership effective immediately. 3 sentences. Victoria had probably written it herself. Nathan heard about it the same way everyone else in the office did through his inbox at 8:14 a.m. He read it twice, then went back to the Alcott Tower remediation file he had been working on, a full respecification of the core column materials, rebuilding the structural design from the original approved plans. The work was detailed and would take weeks, but it was the kind of work Nathan understood in his bones, and there was something settling about returning to it. He saw Victoria for the first time in the office 2 days later, in the hallway outside the engineering department. She was walking with purpose. She was always walking with purpose, but she stopped when she saw him, and for a moment neither of them performed the professional distance the setting usually required. She said, "Your office, 10 minutes." He said, "Okay." In his office with the door closed, she told him what was happening. The internal audit had confirmed the full scope of the fraud, not just the Alcott Tower material substitutions, but a broader pattern of financial diversions across 4 projects over 14 months. The amounts involved exceeded $2.3 million. The board was being restructured. 3 members had already resigned. The company's outside legal team was coordinating with the city's building safety office on the Alcott Tower situation, and the remediation plan Nathan had drafted was going to serve as the baseline for the revised specifications. Then she told him about the second thing. Blackridge Group was creating a new position, Director of Structural Integrity, executive-level reporting directly to the CEO's office. The role would oversee quality assurance across all active projects, not just the engineering review, but the procurement chain, the specification approval process, the material sourcing. It was essentially the function that should have existed before any of this happened. The function whose absence had made the fraud possible in the first place. Victoria said she wanted Nathan in that position. He looked at her. He thought about the Alcott Tower file open on his desk, about the 32 floors that were going to be built correctly now, about the people who would eventually work in that building, without knowing how close it had come to being something else entirely. He thought about the morning Marsh had called him into the conference room and implied there was a promotion waiting for people who chose correctly. He thought about how different this felt from that. He said yes. Victoria nodded. She said, "I'll have the formal offer to you by end of week." Efficient, forward-moving, her CEO voice. But just before she opened his office door, she stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "Thank you, Nathan." Not in her CEO voice, in something quieter, more deliberate, the kind of thank you that has weight because it's been considered carefully before it's given. She was gone before he had to figure out what to say to that. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, Nathan came home to find Victoria Hale standing at his front door. No suitcase this time, Just her coat, the city settling into dusk behind her, and that same expression she'd worn the very first night, composed, but with something underneath it that she wasn't trying to hide as carefully as usual. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to fill the space with explanation. She said she'd been in the neighborhood. He didn't believe that, and she knew he didn't believe it, and neither of them mentioned it. He opened the door wider, and she stepped inside. The house was exactly as it had been, small, quiet, 1,200 square feet of engineered routine. But it didn't feel the same as it had 3 weeks ago. Something had changed in the way the space held itself, though Nathan couldn't have written that in a report and wouldn't have tried. He made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table in the spot she had occupied every evening for nearly 2 weeks and looked at the surface in front of her with the expression of someone who has recently understood something they'd been circling around for a while. When he set the mug down, she picked it up without looking away from whatever she was thinking, the same way she'd done at midnight, over documents and legal pads, and a problem that had once seemed impossible to survive. After a while, she said she had been thinking about something since the board meeting. She said that in 4 years of running Blackridge Group, she had learned to assess people quickly, a necessary skill when you had a company full of them and limited time. She had assessed Nathan as competent and incorruptible on the basis of 2 pushback reports, and she had come to his house that first night because the math had been straightforward. Then she said the math had turned out to be incomplete, that there were things in a person that didn't show up in reports or behavioral patterns, and that she had spent years believing those things didn't matter as much as the measurable ones. The past 2 weeks had given her reason to revise that conclusion. Nathan listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, without interrupting, without performing a reaction, just absorbing it fully. When she finished, he said, "You came back without a suitcase." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Not a CEO smile, not a performance, just a small and genuine thing that had slipped through the control she maintained the way most people maintained breathing. She said, "I came back without a suitcase." He said, "Then you're not running from anything." She said, "No." Outside, Seattle was doing what Seattle did in the early weeks of the year, cold overcast, the kind of sky that made the lit windows of houses look warmer than they actually were. Nathan sat across from her at the kitchen table and drank his coffee, and the house was quiet in the way it used to be quiet before she arrived, except that it wasn't the same quiet. It was fuller. Not smaller the way he had once thought it would feel. Just fuller. Some things you build to code and they hold. Some things you build to the actual load they're going to carry, and they hold better. Nathan Cole had spent his career knowing the difference. He was beginning to understand. It applied to more than buildings. His life had changed the night she'd stood in the rain at his door, with a suitcase and 4 words that made the walls close in. He understood that now, clearly without resistance. The system he had built to survive his life had been functional. This was something else, something with a higher tolerance, a stronger core built from the kind of material you couldn't substitute, without it showing up in the numbers. The coffee was warm. The house was quiet. Victoria Hale was sitting at his kitchen table without a suitcase, and Nathan Cole was not for the first time in a long time somewhere else.